I'm here to set the record straight, because you all so gay. Graven is not a bad game. It's also not a good game. It's an excellent game, and I feel like I have to come to its defense here with a Yo Gamer Recommends video. Because if you give credit to all these negative reviews on Steam, and all these YouTube videos that are shitting on Graven, you may end up giving it a pass. And that would be a pity, because if you have been following this channel, there's a good chance that Graven is for you. Of all the videos shitting on Graven, I think the one titled Graven Has an Identity Crisis is the one that best encompasses how the naysayers feel about the game. But an identity crisis is something that you would say of a game that features mechanics that don't quite work together. But I don't think that's the case at all with Graven. I think 3D Realms knew exactly what they wanted their game to be, and they borrowed mechanics from various different genres to make it happen. Graven is essentially a game about figuring out. It's about figuring out how to get rid of the bad guys in the most efficient way, it's about figuring out how to progress further into the game's quests, and it's about figuring out how to get around the various locations in which the game takes place. And I think that in many ways, Graven revisits the many forms that the figuring out aspect of gaming has taken over the course of the years. Back in the 80s, a lot of people had fun stumping those Goombas and Koopas in Mario Bros. But some of us thought, what happens if I duck over this pipe? And those of us who did had our curiosity rewarded when we were transported to this room full of coins, or when we found the famous secret room that allowed us to cheat the game. Later in the 90s, we had fun blasting enemies to pieces with our arsenal, but we also ran around like mad spamming the spacebar on every wall trying to find that elusive secret room filled with loot, monsters, or both. And sometimes we would even do the level again and again until we saw that 100% number of secrets found. In the early 2000s, we played Myst 3 Exile, a game that was entirely about figuring out stuff. And there was something endlessly fulfilling about finding out that each of the worlds we went to in the game was governed by its own system of rules, and the key to success was to figure out the logic behind each of these worlds. Then in the early 2010s, we played Dark Souls, a game that became all the talk because of its combat and its difficulty. But to some of us, the level design was where the game truly shone. Figuring out the intricacies of the game's world, kicking down that ladder, or unlocking that door that saved us hours of walking about, or falling off the beaten trail to access areas that would have otherwise remained unexplored was almost as fun as killing the bad guys, if not more. I suppose you could say that every game is about figuring out stuff to a certain extent. Puzzle games make it abundantly clear that you're not going to get any further until you figure out what to do with these mirrors, levers, or tiles. Streets of Rage 4, for example, is not a puzzle game, but there is some stuff for you to figure out. For example, it's not readily obvious that landing a lot of hits is better than using heavy attacks that knock enemies on their asses, because the bigger the streak of hits, the faster your score is going to go up, and the faster your score goes up, the sooner you get an extra life, and spare lives are your insurance in this game. But the game doesn't explicitly tell you this, and you can't even finish the game in the normal difficulty without ever coming to the realization that combos make all the difference between efficacy and efficiency in this game. And see, you may think that walking around the screen and looking for low risk / high reward opportunities and using heavy attacks constantly to disrupt enemy moves is the safe way to play this game. But when you play the game in the highest difficulty level, this tactic is no longer viable, and is the game's way of telling you that that's not how you're supposed to play it. And you'd be a fool to say, oh, this game is impossible in the highest difficulty level, because chances are it isn't. You've just not figured out the way or ways to play it properly. And I think this is where a lot of the criticism that's been thrown at Graven is coming from. I think a lot of people jumped into this one expecting it to play the way they played games like Heretic or Exen. But most of them quit, telling by what I read in the comments, because they became frustrated because their tried and true boomer shooter approach didn't quite work the way they expected in Graven. And no shit, it didn't work. After tasting this particular blend of Graven whiskey, my palate tells me that there is Heretic, Myst, Deus Ex, Dark Souls, and some metroidvania in this blend. But that's what it is, a blend. Graven isn't trying to be any of these games. If you have watched footage of Graven, you might get the impression that it is essentially a first-person shooter along the lines of Heretic or Exen, and it isn't. You shoot things in Graven, sure, and sometimes being good at it can get you out of tight spots. But in Graven, killing enemies isn't only about dealing damage to them. So this user had this to say. I also found most of these weapons just don't feel that powerful, especially the magic feels super weak. The fire spell at the beginning of the game is a joke, it does basically 0 damage. Its sole purpose is to solve puzzles. The wrist crossbow has such piss poor hit feedback and horrible accuracy that I can't tell if I hit enemies most of the times. The scope upgrade for it is useless because the scope is dirty and you can barely see. Well, dear user, I'll let you know that in this part of the game I placed this powder keg down this choke point. I used the wrist crossbow to pull a group of zombies to it, and then I switched over to the fire spell that you say does 0 damage to light the thing on fire and blow them all up. I did this several times in the game, by the way. I figured these powder kegs and boxes that were lying around couldn't be there just as part of the decoration.
Are your 2 initials Y and Y? Because you are too wise. Too wise, my friend.
As for the hit feedback on the crossbow, I think that blood spurting out of your enemies is a pretty solid indication that the shot landed. And as for the efficiency of the wrist crossbow and the scope upgrade, I'll let my viewers judge for themselves.
Tactical cheese. Tactical cheese.
Magic in this game is used in various ways, and puzzle solving is indeed one of them. But magic is also tremendously useful in combat. Like I said, killing enemies in Graven isn't only about dealing damage. You can't use your fire spell to set enemies ablaze and send them running around like mad while you melee the toughest bad guys, or the ones that aren't weak to fire. As you can see, you can also use exploding barrels and choke points and use your fire spell to make them explode to take out a bunch of bad guys. You can also use fire to kill enemies with damage over time from the other side of a fence as a low-risk, high-reward tactic.
You mean to cheese them?
Shh. But fire can also be used to do direct damage, and it can be very powerful if you use it on enemies that are weak to fire. These cultists, for example, die almost instantly when you set them on fire. Lightning, for example, doesn't do any damage. But when you are outnumbered and fighting in close quarters, you can use a good lightning attack to stun enemies in place and then kill them with your melee weapon. Mastering this technique in higher difficulty levels is almost mandatory. Same thing goes for your frost spell. If you don't use your frost spell in combination with your strong flail attack against these mofos, you're probably going to have to use something like ballista bolts against them, and those are in short supply. There aren't as many of those inside crates and barrels as there are of other weapons like your wrist crossbow or your fletching. Graven is one of the best games I've ever played when it comes to weapon variety and the tactical depth of your arsenal. This discount Necronomicon tome, for example, may not be the best weapon in the world for most situations. It's actually kinda lame, but if you read its description, you will get a pretty good idea of the situations for which you might want to give it a spin. And believe me, in the right situations, it makes a world of difference. This repeating crossbow with icicles is probably my favorite weapon. It has deadly accuracy and it hits pretty hard, but you may need to shoot these ugly icy motherfuckers 2 or 3 times to get them down. Makes sense because they are made of ice, but a single well-placed bolt from your ballista will also do the trick. My point is that while Graven draws its fair share of inspiration from Heretic and Exen, it's not trying to be any of these games. In Heretic, while there are little secrets here and there for you to find, your progress in the game does not depend on you figuring out these secrets. If you follow the beaten trail in Heretic and kill everything along the way, you will eventually find the door that leads to the next level. But in Graven, you need to figure out how to get around the world, and puzzle solving is a big part of that. Puzzle solving is seamlessly woven into the fabric of the game. It reminds me of the world of Edana in Myst 3 Exile. Edana didn't have tiles, buttons, or lever-based puzzles. It was all about figuring out the rules of the world, which is also more or less the case with Graven. But you also have some of those tile, buttons, and lever puzzles in Graven, and most of them are mandatory. Puzzle logic is not coded properly, this other user says. Well, I got through the entire game without ever looking up how to solve any of the puzzles. If you take the time to look around and read every piece of journal that's lying about, chances are that by the time you reach one of these puzzles, you will have all the clues you need to figure them out easily. And if you don't have all the clues, you'll know which ones you are missing. That's the game's way of coding the puzzle. The game wants you to look around, it wants you to be thorough in your exploration, and it rewards you for doing this. But don't get it wrong, while there are a few tile, lever, and button-based puzzles, that's not what the bulk of the puzzle solving is about in Graven. Puzzle solving is baked into all of the game's mechanics. I am going to give you a teeny tiny spoiler of a little passage of the game just so that you get an idea of what I mean by this. It's a spoiler, yes,
But it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
and it's going to be worth it, I promise. So in order to progress further into the game, you need to exit this area here. It is filled with monsters and you have to take care of those, of course, but you need to exit through this gate right here. Now if you pull this lever here, the gate will open, but it will only remain open for a few seconds. So if you jump into the water and start swimming towards the gate, after you pull the lever, you won't ever make it before the gate closes again, no matter how fast you swim. Now inside this room, you find a new spell for your spell book, and this spell is useful to freeze some enemies or to slow them down so that you can finish them off quickly. And the game doesn't tell you this, but you can also use this spell to freeze water, just like you can use your fire spell to melt snow. So if you use your frost spell to freeze the little pond that's between the lever and the gate, you can now pull the lever and run over the frozen pond to make your exit on time. And there are many situations like this in this game, and if figuring out stuff is what Graven is about, then thorough exploration and experimentation are the most important means by which you do this. If you play this game, guys, be thorough. Look under every nook and cranny, take a dive into every lake and river, make that perilous jump that may end up costing your life, because that's how you find the key that you've been missing, the spell that makes a difference in combat, the shrine that makes you stronger, and the inconspicuous tiny journal entry that helps you make sense out of those pesky tile puzzles. Level design reminds me of Dark Souls in many ways. In Graven, sometimes you kill hordes upon hordes of enemies, you sort out dangerous traps, and you solve head-scratching puzzles only to roll down a rope ladder or open a door that connects two areas of the map that you have already been to. And while this doesn't sound like much of a reward, believe me, it feels like you've made huge progress every time this happens. This user said, firstly, the ill-begotten checkpoint system. Yes, everyone has been complaining about it, but for good reason. Quick saves are a no here, I get that. But why must I be subjected to running all the way back to where I was to begin with before having exited the game previously? It makes it hard for me to want to come back. The thing is that you aren't being subjected to do this. This is the main reason why you have to risk your neck against this bolt-slinging trap and this sniper skelly. This is why you have to enter this room full of enemies even if there's no mandatory quest item here. So that you can lower that ladder, open that door, or summon that elevator so that you don't have to run all the way back to where you were every time you die or every time you come back to the game after taking a break. There is a reason why you always start at the city every time you go back to the game. It's not bad design, this is how all the risks you took to explore every corner of the map pay off. Also, as it happens in Dark Souls, you are going to have to go back to some of the locations you left behind. And because you went the long way the first time around, you know how costly, risky, and time-consuming that can be. And in Graven, you need to go back to some locations because, like some reviewers have mentioned, Graven is also a bit of a metroidvania in some respects. In Graven, you find items that you can then use to access some places that were inaccessible the first time you passed them by. And reading the item's description is a good way to refresh your memories about those places you couldn't access earlier. Ever so often you also get a bit of that sweet OG Deus Ex design. You stack up crates and jump over them to get to places that you're not supposed to get to by doing that, or you take the inconspicuous secret underwater route to access a building. And I think that Graven is at its very best when it leans into the OG Deus Ex-like design. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen as frequently as I would like. Many times I felt like the game was baiting me into thinking that there were many ways to solve a problem or access a place, when in truth, I was required to do things the one way the game expected me to. Graven is not a first-person shooter like Heretic, it's not a puzzle-solving game like Myst, it's not a metroidvania like Symphony of the Night, it doesn't fully commit to the player-driven approach of Deus Ex, and it's definitely not a Souls-like. Instead, it borrows mechanics and principles from all these games to deliver a unique experience that is first and foremost about figuring out how to progress further into the game, and it rewards players for being thorough in their exploration and bold in their experimentation. Graven also expects you to become invested in the game's main character, his mission, and the things that are going on in the world, but unfortunately, it only partially succeeds in achieving this. During the first act of the game, I was thoroughly invested in the main character and the story, and getting to the bottom of the mystery behind the plague was my primary motivation to keep coming back for more. At the beginning of the game, you get a cinematic intro that, for all its pompous rhetoric, it's quite effective at answering the most important questions that need an answer in the first act of any story, like who's the main character, what does he want to achieve, why does he want to achieve that, where does the story take place, what obstacles lay ahead, who are his enemies, and without wasting any time, just as soon as these questions are answered, you find yourself in a dark, plague-ridden town that has definitely seen better days, and you're almost immediately tasked with investigating the origin of the mysterious plague. But there is, of course, more than meets the eye about this plague. So you start pulling the thread of this mystery by exploring the world and finding little journal entries and notes here and there that reveal a little bit more about what's going on. Unfortunately, the thrill and mystery of the story and the prospect of a lengthy epic adventure comes to an abrupt end at the end of the first act, because upon defeating the boss you get another cinematic cutscene in which the game explains that you got to the bottom of the mystery of the plague and the town is now safe thanks to you, and then immediately goes on to tell you that there is this other location that you have to go to meet these other characters that may have answers regarding your mission. And this felt like a thank you Mario, but our princess is in another castle. Why do I have to go to this place in particular?
I don't know.
Why do I have to meet these people in particular?
I don't know.
Graven is divided in 3 acts, but narratively, each of these 3 acts feels almost like self-contained stories that are completely unrelated to each other, which is a little bit disruptive because your main character is in theory on a personal quest all the way through, and this is supposed to unfold into something much larger. It feels as though the developers worked first on the different scenarios and mechanics of the game, and even some of the NPCs, and only then asked the writers to make a story to link all of them together. And it was all decided in a meeting that lasted 5 minutes, in which someone said, listen, the main character dude has to go through 3 major settings: a plague-ridden dark fantasy scenario featuring overgrown ruins and smelly sewers, a snow-covered setting reminiscent of the spine of the world in D&D, and a desert world with a pseudo-Byzantine vibe. Now go make it work. Also, I think the NPCs in this game are the bare minimum effort. Not that I was expecting Deonara or the Elusive Man, but none of these guys or gals have anything relevant to say about your mission, the city, the other citizens, or even the plague that's killing them. Some don't even seem to give 2 shits about the quests they give you. But Graven is first and foremost about its gameplay mix, and I think it really delivers on that end. I'm finding harder and harder to play games all the way through to the end in one go lately. I'm beginning to take long breaks, sometimes for months, before I come back and finish a game. But this wasn't the case with Graven. Every night I played this game, I went to bed looking forward to the next gaming session, and this is always a good sign. There are a few things that I didn't like about Graven. There are insta-kill mechanics in this game, and some of those are of the super scummy gotcha type. There are also things like damage over time in cold lakes and swamps that made me want to avoid these bodies of water rather than explore them, which is strange because Graven is all about rewarding the player for being thorough in his exploration. And yes, there are a few bugs here and there. Yes, climbing ladders is early 2000s bad. And yes, the NPCs feel like a lazy afterthought, and the game isn't all that optimized. And all that gives Graven an incomplete game vibe every once in a while. But if you are Graven's intended audience, I think you are going to have a blast with it. The fun factor is off the charts, it has high quality replay value, and it challenges you in all the ways you like to be challenged, while not breaking your balls too much with challenges that you didn't ask for, which is quite remarkable given the wide and wild array of games that it draws inspiration from. And it currently goes for $13 on Steam, and I think this is one of the very best deals out there, guys. One that's fully deserving of a Yo Gamer Recommend seal of approval. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Come check us out on Discord if you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there. I personally love it and wouldn't change it for anything. Share the video if you thought it was cool, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye, everyone.